We'll go through 38 and 39. Ezekiel 38 and 39. Now, Stan Ballard said, didn't we have messages on our studies on Gog and Magog before? And we did, but it was why there are two battles of Gog and Magog. The battle that we're going to read about here happens at the first part of the tribulation period, and the second Gog and Magog battle happens at the end of human history. It actually is the final battle of all time. And so you have the rapture of the church, the battle of Gog and Magog, the battles of the nations where Jesus said there'll be wars and rumors of wars. Then you'll have the battles where the nations come against Antichrist in the last part of the tribulation period. Then you have the battle of Armageddon, go all the way through the kingdom, and then you have the second Gog and Magog battle. And so what we're going to talk about here is the first one. This happens either on the very first day of the tribulation period or very close in proximity to that first day. So we're in Ezekiel chapter 38 and verse 1. The word of the Lord came to me saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog. Now, the word Gog here is very important because it means a roof or someone, person who is over a nation, a clan, a group, a state, what have you. And so, though we don't have his personal name, we do have his title, Gog. I guess we could call him a president or a director or a leader or prime minister or something like that. But with regard to the Bible word in reference to him, it's Gog. And he is, to put it in modern day vernacular and terminology, head honcho, top dog, whatever. But that's who Gog is. But then it tells us specifically what country he is over. The land of Magog. Now, the land of Magog has to do with an area that we call Russia. So when we're studying through here, we're talking about the leader of the nation of Russia. Now we know that through the years to this point, Russia has had its ups and its downs, and it's gone from superpower status back down to less than a world-class power. But with regard to Bible prophecy, please be aware that Russia is going to rise again. Russia is still very powerful. It can be very powerful, can be a formidable foe, still has nuclear weapons, and it has such an unstable economy that somebody could come in there and take them right back to their former communistic state, take over, and begin its aggressive and assertive nature to be a dominating power in the world. So we're talking about the leader of Russia. And it says the chief prince. Now here again, it's more or less a reiteration of the title Gog. Chief prince is Rosh in the Hebrew, and it means the pinnacle. Not only is he the roof overseeing the whole shebang here, but he is the pinnacle. He's the number one man, so that when you talk about the future in Russia, when this context is realized, Gog becomes the man where the buck stops here. So he is the chief prince, and notice these two things. The chief prince of Meshach. Now, if you trace this word on back, it's very interesting. And it comes from the people who settled the land. And if you look up some of these names, it goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 10, where we have many of these names in the line of Japheth. It is a Gentile rebellion here, and it's going to be hooked to some of those in the line of Ham as well. But Meshach has to do with the area around Moscow. The Muscovites and so forth, and that's how it could be translated. Meshach literally is what we call modern-day Moscow and the area round about. Also, Tobolsk or Tubal here. There's an area in Russia. It's a district, a very large one, called Tobolsk. And so that's what it's referring to here, basically. The leader of Russia, the entirety of the land, and specifically Moscow, the headquarters, the capital of this area, and the dominating province, if you will, or landmass within the Russian state. Now again, it was once smaller, it got larger, then it divided up, the satellites broke from it, but there's no reason at all, as we'll find here, why its satellites will not make another alliance with Russia, and that's what's going to happen. We'll see that in a moment. But note what God says. Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Now, the reason that God is against Gog and this particular country, Russia, is twofold. One, they have been traditionally communistic. And if you're a communist, believe that, who was that? Marx or Stalin who said religion is the opiate of the people. One of those guys, maybe it was Lenin. But religion is the opiate of the people, and we'll let them have it to keep them happy. But the official stance of communism is you're an atheist. It's dialectic materialism, and it is the collective welfare of the state that is the most important. And so traditionally, this whole land has been anti-God. But the second thing about it is there's a whole lot of Jews scattered into Russia, and they have suffered persecution through the years. The play that was on Broadway, Fiddler on the Roof, and it's played worldwide now, but is about the fact of people in Russia and that area being persecuted and never having the ability to put down roots because they've got this fiddler on the roof. And the fiddler represents the hatred of the Jews and anti-Semitism. Well, you see, that strikes right at the heart of God, too. Not only are they rejecting him as a being, they're rejecting his people and persecute them. That's why in droves they're leaving Russia now because of this persecution. So note what it says. Verse 4, I will turn thee back. Now mind you, in the battle of Armageddon and in the last battle of Gog and Magog, God does not turn them back. That's how it's one of the clues that we know that it is a separate battle and it happens prior to the rest of these things. It doesn't happen during Armageddon, and it's not the final battle of history. Why? Because in those things, God comes down with fire and just burns the flesh off people, and that's it. There is no turning back because nobody is left. But we're going to find that God is going to leave a sixth of this army remaining, keep them alive, and they're going to be alive to fight in the future time. So I will turn thee back. I will put hooks into your jaws. Now, there's not a person here that hadn't been fishing, doesn't understand that. The fish takes the bait, and off it goes in a certain direction, and what do? You pull back on the rod to sink the hook. And once you sink the hook, you're pulling that fish now in the other direction. And that's what God is saying. I'm going to sink the hook. You're coming down towards Israel, but before you get a chance to destroy my people, I'm going to sink the hook and pull you back the other direction. So, it talks about, I will bring thee forth, your army, and all those with you. Now, note verse 5. Persia, Ethiopia, Libya, with them, all them with shield and helmet, Gomer and his bands, the house of Togarmah, the north quarters, all his bands, and many people with you. So these verses let us know that there is another alliance with Russia amongst smaller nations that could be considered satellites. Now, who are these people? They're people that we know. Persia, of course, is modern-day Iran. And there have always been friendly relations between the Iranians and Russia, supplying food, tanks, weapons, stirring things up and the like. And that's who it is. Remember going back, what was it, the 70s, early 80s, the Ayatollah Khomeini and the Iranian crisis with Ronald Reagan and so forth. Jimmy Carter, it was his administration that had it. So here is Iran. But something else about this. Remember where the wise men were from? Persia. And it simply means that these people have been evangelized. They know about the Jewish God. They know about the Jewish Savior. Where is he that is born King of the Jews? But it doesn't matter. Those people are now Muslims, and it's basically a state religion, and that's all she wrote. Ethiopia, the northeastern land there in Africa. What about these people? Have they been evangelized? Absolutely. Queen of Sheba was an Ethiopian. She went to see Solomon and said, the half has not been told about you, your God, and his temple, and your kingdom here. Also, remember, in Acts chapter 8, Philip, the kingdom evangelist, was led of the Holy Spirit to a eunuch from Ethiopia. That's why he's called the Ethiopian eunuch. And he was saved, and he was a treasurer of Ethiopia, and went back there and led a lot of people to Christ. But we know now that Ethiopia is basically a Muslim nation as well. Libya, Muammar Gaddafi. Would you like to get him in your sights? I'm sure that there are several people who didn't get their verdict on the Pan Am bombing and so forth, would like to take a shot at him or two. But that's Libya. Again, another Muslim state. And all of these states are friendly with Russia. Now, here's one here, verse number 6. Gomer is Germany. I'm going to take us on a little rabbit's trail with regard to Gomer. You'll remember that after World War II, Gomer, or Germany, was divvied up to East and West. The East went communistic. The West was friendly toward America and Europe and so forth, NATO. But all of a sudden, the wall came down and they were reunited. However, even though they're reunited, I look up every so often, and the East Germans are not all that happy with what's going on. Now, here's what I believe happened. You hold your place here because we're coming right back. Go to Revelation chapter 13. Now, those of you that have studied with me on these things before, the 10 nations of Antichrist, know that I teach that Germany is one of the inner 4 nations of Antichrist. It will be Spain, France, Italy, and Germany, and then the other 6 will be added to it. But if you'll come up here to verse 1 in chapter 13, I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea. Now, John's looking, here's the Mediterranean. He's looking toward Western Europe, and he sees this beast coming, and it is representing the kingdom of Antichrist. Upon his heads, and he has got 7 of them, he has 10 horns. So you've got 7 of these horns, and then on one head, the central head, you've got 3. And remember in Daniel, that's what happens. Antichrist comes, and there are 10 kings, and he overthrows 3, and then he makes them his puppets. And so it comes down to 7 heads and 10 horns, or 7 geographical locations, and 10 rulers. And that's what this is. And upon his heads the name of blasphemy. The name of blasphemy is the Holy Roman Empire, which becomes revived and revised into these 10 nations plus the satellites. But as you're looking, it talks about some other things in verse 2 that are descriptive of this beast. But it says in verse 3, I saw one of his heads. Now, what is the head or one of the heads of the beast? We just identified them up here as geographical locations or national entities, or a nation that has specific boundaries. And so it says, I saw one of its heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed. And all the world wondered after the beast. I believe this is what happens. That Germany separates again along the very same lines that were originally established after World War II. And Gomer goes to the Gog and Magog battle with, the first battle with Gog. And then that happens at the first of the tribulation period. After things are destroyed, they reject their alliance with Russia and come back and realign themselves with the nation of Germany and the kingdom of Antichrist. And that's what is being described here, that Gomer splits again, goes with Russia, fights in the northern hills of Israel, but they lose. And as they go limping back, they say, well, this was a bad deal, that we should never have done this. And they realign themselves with the beast. Okay, so let's go back. And verse number 6. Gomer is Germany, and it's of course to the west of where we're talking about. But straight south is the house of Togarmah. And Togarmah has to do with Turkey. Now here's the interesting thing about Turkey and Iran. If you come straight south from Russia, you've got to go through Turkey in order to get to Israel and Jerusalem. And Iran is over here, and butted up against Iran is the eastern side of Turkey. And Turkey, east and west, is a pretty long nation. So they can go up there, and they can have bivouacs and headquarters and air bases and that sort of thing in Turkey. But another important thing about Turkey is you go all the way to the west. It is the only opening to the Mediterranean Sea, is the only opening to the Atlantic Ocean from the Black Sea. And it straddles what's called the Bosporus Straits. And so if Russia controls Turkey, they can get their ships in and out of there easily with the Russian fleet. And that's why Turkey is such a strategic nation here. And so it's Turkey, or Togarmah of the north quarters, all his bands and many other people with thee. So there is a reformed alliance with Russia and these various satellites. However, it says, be you prepared, verse 7. Prepare yourself and all your company that are assembled. Be a guard to them. Why? Because after many days you will be visited. Now, most of us here would like to have a visit from God. I would hope he'd serve a little notice. We could get cleaned up, be ready for him, have a little soup on, the coffee set. He'd ring the doorbell and would welcome him in. But this is talking about a different kind of visit. Remember, he just said, I am against you, O Gog, and I'm going to pay you a visit, and this is a visit of retribution. In the latter years, it's going to you'll come into the land that is brought back from the sword. Now, what does that mean? The land that is brought back from the sword. Well, if you hold your place here, and let's go to the book of Luke. Luke chapter 21. It is a reference to the fact that Israel is to anticipate a dispersion off the land and into the four corners of the world. And that, of course, happened at 70 A.D. when Titus, the Roman general, came and destroyed the temple and the sanctuary and took every Jew from off the land at that time. But now, this verse of Scripture in Ezekiel is telling us that it's going to go full circle. That just as the Jews were taken off the land by the sword, it's going to be bought back by the sword. And that's exactly what has happened. The Jews have been in a position now to fight for their own land, thanks to the help of some nations, in the United States of America, for example, and to fight for their own land. And so there's a contingent of Jews there with a viable government, and they're not going to leave without a fight. And so note, if you will, verse number 24, and they shall fall by the edge of the sword and they shall be led away captive to all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down to the Gentiles till the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Now, this is a prediction just a few years down from, Jesus is talking here, a few years forward in history when the temple is destroyed and the Jews are dispersed. Now let's come back to verse 8 of Ezekiel 38. They're going to come back to the land that is brought back from the sword and is gathered out of many people. God's going to regather Israel to the land. And you're going to come against the mountains of Israel. Now, there are several times here in these chapters that talk about these Gog and Magog coming from the north. And of course, if you run a line straight from Jerusalem upward, you go right through Moscow. Note, if you will, verse number 6. It talks about Togarmah of the north quarters. And in other places, it refers to the fact that Russia comes north, gathers its troops and comes north to march on Israel. So therefore, when it says against the mountains of Israel, it's talking about things that have been in the news. The mountains of Israel that line the coast of Lebanon. The mountains of Israel that line the coast of Syria. We keep hearing of the Golan Heights. Now, you talk about a strategic piece of land. They want to exchange that for peace. Nonsense. Because the one that controls that land is going to control a whole lot of northern Israel, and especially the water supply. And if you've looked over there, there's one thing they do not have a lot of, and that's water for all the people there. So it says, these mountains in northern Israel have been waste, but it's brought forth of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. Now, here's the key. Here's an indication. The safety aspect has to do with Antichrist signing a peace pact with Israel to allow them their temple worship, and the fact that he would vouch for them and protect them in the land. Hold your place and let's go to Daniel 9. In verse 27. And it says, and he shall confirm the covenant. Now this has nothing to do, this is Daniel 9:27, with the covenant, with any covenant that God gave to Israel. This is the covenant that he is giving to Israel. To do what? To cause or in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. But that simply means that when he makes this covenant, he allows the temple sacrifices to continue, and he's going to guarantee them. The reason they cease is 3.5 years later, he comes in and he sets the abomination or overspreading of abominations, the abomination of desolation, until the end. But confirming that covenant means that he is going to guarantee Israel's safety among the nations. And so when we come here to the book of Ezekiel and we see the last part of verse 8 here, they shall dwell safely, all of them. Here's what I believe is happening. As Israel and Antichrist are at the peace table negotiating, Russia understands what's happening, and so they act to preempt all of this and to have it to fight Western Europe. They can get entrenched. They can get rooted there, get established there before Antichrist has the right to bring his troops in to protect Israel. So this is happening toward the beginning of the tribulation period where they sign this, and Israel says, finally, we're safe. And Russia says, no, you're not. I'm going to come down there, and I'm going to claim that land for us. And not let the Antichrist have it. So what does it say? Verse 9, you will ascend and come like a storm. Thou shalt be like a cloud to cover the land. You'll have all your bands, and this has to do with the groups of people, many people with you. And it shall come to pass that at the same time shall things come into your mind, and thou shalt think an evil thought. Literal Hebrew is a wicked strategy here. It's a way to beat God and beat the people of God and get their possessions and their land and destroy them. You will say, I'll go up to the land of unwalled villages. I'll go to them that are at rest, that dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates. Now see, up to this point, Antichrist is not there. They've just signed the pact so that although he promises security, his security forces are not yet in place. So, goes on. Here's your wicked thought. You're going to take a spoil and take a prey. Now, it tells us what that is. Turn your hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited and upon the people. So you're going to get the land and the possessions and the people, and you're going to enslave them or kill them. The people that are gathered out of all nations, has to be the Jews, that now have cattle and goods and dwell in the midst of the land. Israel, in certain respects, is a prosperous nation. As a matter of fact, that's one of the things built into the covenant. He gives the Jew the ability to make wealth or create wealth. Why? Because it says that the Gentiles shall borrow of you. You're not going to borrow of the Gentiles. You'll lend to them, but you'll never borrow from them because you're going to be the head nation over all the earth. And therefore, he's got to have a very, very wealthy, prosperous nation. Let's move on down. Sheba, Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish. Now, these are other nations that are beginning to look at Russia as they're coming down here and saying, well, now what are you doing down here? Let's join in. Aren't you come to take a spoil? Have you gathered thy company to take a prey, to carry away silver and gold? We want in on the action, as it were. So there are undoubtedly millions of people now that are making their way from the north down to the mountains of northern Israel, and quite a horde of people. But here's what God says about it. Therefore, Son of Man, prophesy and say to Gog, thus saith the Lord God, in that day. Now remember, it's a specific future day in the latter days when Israel dwells safely. So it has to be just prior to, on the day of, or just after the signing of the peace pact with Antichrist, where Israel feels secure that he's going to do something about this. But evidently they've acted just a little bit too late because they've already filtered in. They've already invaded. On the mountains, they have bivouacked, and these millions of soldiers are there. Probably right in the area of Megiddo, where Antichrist will later on come in and establish his headquarters. So it says, verse 15, and you'll come from thy place out of the north parts, many people with you, riding on horses. You'll come up against my people Israel, verse 16, a cloud to cover the land. And that is indicative you can't see the land because of the shadows of all the people there. You know, there are just masses of people. In the latter days, I'll bring you against the land. But I've got a little plan involved. What is that? I'll bring you against my land, that the heathen might know me when I shall be sanctified in thee, O Gog, before their eyes. Now, remember how this is playing out. We've got the tribulation period, and we've got this Gog and Magog one happening right at the beginning or the opening of the tribulation. Now, what's going to be happening in the tribulation period? Well, and this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world. There has to be an announcement and an acknowledgement of the God of Israel, and a recognition by some Gentiles at least that he's got a program going on. And the way that he is going to have one of these wake-up calls, hello, you haven't been listening, but now all of a sudden the whole world's going to have its eyes glued, and at least give a consideration of it, is what he does to Gog and Magog. Israel doesn't destroy them. Antichrist doesn't destroy them. No other nation comes or could stand against these at this particular time. But God destroys them. And the purpose is to wake up the nations. So, verse 17. Are you he of whom I've spoken in old time by my servants the prophets of Israel, which prophesied in those days many years that I would bring thee against them? In other words, there are others, and Ezekiel's just one of many that's talking about the fact that people from the northern parts of the world directly above Israel are going to march down in the latter days and attempt to take that land. So, it will come to pass at the same time when Gog shall come against the land of Israel, that my fury shall come up in my face. I like that. You ever had your fury up in your face? Get beat red, mad, you can feel the steam rising, and so forth, and that's what it says. Okay? You've gone ahead and done it. For my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath have I spoken. Now here's what's going to happen. Here you have these millions of soldiers, the northern parts of Israel, undoubtedly straddling Lebanon, straddling Syria, and so forth. But they're all on the mountains of North Israel. In that day there shall be a great shaking in the land of Israel. Now here's another key, that this is not a universal or a global judgment per se. It is a local judgment, which is not true with the Battle of Armageddon, and it's not true with the Battle of Gog and Magog too. This is a local judgment on North Israel upon the soldiers in those mountains there. So that the fishes of the sea, the fowls of the heaven, the beasts of the field, all the creeping things on the earth, it's going to have its repercussions globally, but it's not a global judgment. It comes down on North Israel. And the earth shall shake at my presence, and the mountains there shall be thrown down. The steep places shall fall. Every wall shall fall to the ground. I will call for a sword against him throughout all my mountains, saith the Lord. Every man's sword shall be against his brother. There are several times in the scripture when God had their own soldiers to go against one another and kill one another off because there was confusion. They didn't know who could be trusted, and they were just fighting one another and killed each other off. But that's not all. I will plead against him with pestilence, with blood. I'll rain upon him and upon his bands and upon many people that are with him, and overflowing rain, great hailstones, fire, and brimstone. Thus I will magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they'll know that I am the Lord. Now they're going to have to think, before Antichrist gets his full deception operational, and he deceives the whole world to join him in this mark of the beast, except for the remnant. The nations are warned that Jehovah God is for Israel, and that his program is now functional. So that brings us down then to verse number 1 in Ezekiel 39. Therefore, Son of Man, prophesy against Gog. Now, he's going to more or less reiterate here, but we're going to read it because he includes some more info. I will turn thee back. Now, we just said that twice. I'm against you, and I'm going to turn you back. But note in verse number 2, here's an interesting thing. I'm going to leave the sixth part of thee. In other words, he kills 5/6 of these soldiers, and 1/6 of them go marching back to the land. Now, the reason is the king of the north and Russian soldiers are seen again in the latter part of the tribulation period, coming down to fight against Antichrist, but eventually will be reunited with him, or united with him. So Russia still has 1/6 of its soldiers, and somebody said that if there were 1 million soldiers there, 1/6 of them left is something like 166,667 soldiers. That's 1/6 of a million that is left. Now that's still a lot of soldiers, not a 1 million man march, but still a whole lot of soldiers. So he says, I'm going to smite you and so forth. Verse 4, another indication it is a localized judgment. You will fall upon the mountains of Israel, you and all your bands, the people that's with you. And I will give thee unto the ravenous birds of every sort. Now, somebody's going to say, well, wait a minute, Pastor. In Revelation 19, God calls the birds of the heavens and so forth, and they too come and feast on the armies. Doesn't that indicate it's the same thing? No, it is not the same thing. The birds that are gathered in Revelation 17 are gathered at the end of the tribulation period. They are gathered in the valley of Jehoshaphat and in the area round about Jerusalem, where all of these soldiers are killed of the Lord. The birds here are gathered at the first part of the tribulation period, and they're gathered to the place in northern Israel, not southern Israel, southeastern Israel. So you have to keep those two gatherings in mind. Now, the same thing happens. You get these hungry birds, and they're gathered to eat. Because, verse 5, you'll fall upon the open field. I'll send a fire on Magog, and among them that dwell carelessly in the isles. Now, the word isle there is somewhat misunderstood. It's not talking about islands as such, though in other contexts it could talk about an island. But it's talking about a nation with delineated boundaries, set among other nations. And the isles here are a reference to all the nations that are with Russia as they come down. They that dwell carelessly in the isles, they're going to know that I'm the Lord. So will I make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel, and I will not let them, meaning Russia and its satellites, pollute my holy name anymore. Now, what were they doing? They were atheists and they were anti-Semites. And they were questioning the character of God to do anything for his people or if he ever existed. And God is judging these people for those two things, atheism and anti-Semitism. And he says, once this happens, I'm not going to allow them to do this anymore. Behold, it is come and is done, saith the Lord. This is the day whereof I have spoken. They that dwell in the cities of Israel shall go forth. Now, here's another reason we know it's the first part of the tribulation period. They that dwell in the cities of Israel shall go forth and set on fire and burn the weapons, the shields, bucklers, bows, arrows, handstaves, spears, and so forth. Burn them with fire 7 years. Now, you will recall that in the last 3.5 years, those in southern Israel have a place prepared of God for 3.5 years in Petra and those surrounding areas. Now, I don't know what God does. There are caverns there. There are aquifers there. There are places to catch water and so forth. And they're going to be provided for. Maybe it'll be a little manna. I don't know how God is going to do it. But it says they're going to have food and water and protection as a remnant 3.5 years. But that's southern Israel. How do the believing Jews in northern Israel go out to the wilderness, and how are they provided for? The Russian army does it. It says they're going to burn these things with fire 7 years, so that they take no wood out of the field, neither cut down any of the forest. For they shall burn the weapons with fire, and spoil those that spoiled them, and rob those that robbed them. Great switcheroo here. And so believing Jews that scatter because of the presence of Antichrist will have something provided for them in northern Israel so that they can hide. All right. Now here's something else as our time is ticking away. But I think this is extremely interesting. And there's great significance here. It's going to come to pass in that day that I will give Gog a place there in Israel, of graves in Israel. Now, why is this important? It's important because when the Jews were scattered And many of them, hundreds of thousands of them, ended up in Russia. They were more or less buried there. I mean, they had their own separate culture and so forth. And here were these Russians that persecuted them, allowed them to live there. At least they didn't kill them all off and so forth, but they persecuted them, and they were almost lost. They were almost gone. And so Gog and Magog almost buried the Israelites whenever the Israelites were there. So God says, I'm going to reverse that situation. I'm going to bring millions of you down into Israel, and I'm going to bury you in Israel. So that when you look at Israel, just as you thought you triumphed over the Jews when they were with you and tried to bury them, what was Khrushchev say? We will bury you. Now you're coming down here, and I'm going to bury you there. Great significance. On the at the Great White Throne judgment, when death and hell are brought up for judgment, where will Gog and the people of Magog be brought up from as far as these soldiers are concerned? Where are their bodies? Nation of Israel. It's kind of poetic justice, kind of ironic. That they're not even buried in their own land. They get raised for judgment from Israel. Okay. I will give Gog a place there of the graves in Israel, and it's called the Valley of the Passengers on the east of the sea. Now this is the east of the Mediterranean Sea, and amongst the mountains there, of those that are left from the great shaking, a whole lot of shaking going on, there is going to be dedicated a valley. And that valley, last part of verse 11, is called the Valley of Hamon-Gog. Literally, the valley dedicated to the multitudes of Gog who died in Israel. They're not going to be allowed to be buried just any place. They're going to be picked up, gathered together, and buried in this valley as a testimony to God's power. Okay, but now we're ahead of ourselves. Let's back up. The Valley of the Passengers on the east of the sea. Now, there are several main routes coming north-south to Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and these various places. Note what it's going to do. It's going to stop the noses of the passengers. You're going to have to complain to your travel agent. He should have picked you a better route or flown you over this place, because there are so many rotting corpses there. It's not very pleasant. And there shall they bury Gog and his multitude in the valley dedicated to the multitudes of Gog. 7 months. Now, if we're right in the 7 years being the tribulation period, and here all this happens, 7 months into the tribulation period, we have Jews burying these Russians and their allies. You say, well, Pastor, what about Antichrist? Antichrist doesn't come to Israel until the midst of the week. So the normal Jewish rulers are in place during the first 3.5 years and these 7 months. And they're going to be burying them that the land might be cleansed. Yea, all the people shall bury them, and it shall be to them a renown in that day. Victory over their enemies. Gratification that God acted on their behalf. That I shall be glorified. Now remember just a couple other things here with regard to this picture. When God does this, there are other things happening on that first day of the tribulation period. The peace is signed with Antichrist, but the mark of the beast is not in effect in Israel till the midst of the week. There's a 3.5-year period there. On the first day, the 2 witnesses come down, Moses and Elijah. On the first day following, Moses and Elijah evidently preached to 144,000 who become preachers for 3.5 years till they're caught up in the midst of the week. And so there are a lot of things happening here. And one of the things that awakens Israel and awakens the Gentiles with the gospel of the kingdom is Jehovah destroying Gog and Magog at this point. And so there will be lots of Jews saved during that time, and Gentiles as well. Okay, where am I here? So it's going to take them they're going to cleanse the face of the earth, Israel. At the end of 7 months, they'll search. The passengers that pass through the land, when they see any man's bone, this is interesting. It's all got to be gathered together. If they find a bone, they just don't leave it there. They just don't bury it there. It's buried at a specific spot, the Valley of Gog. And they're going to bury it they're going to put a sign by it. Now, here you are. You're on a family picnic. you're traveling through. You got your chicken, chicken soup and whatever. Your unleavened bread and so forth, and all of a sudden you spread the blanket and there you are under some tree, and all of a sudden you see there a hand or a leg or some bone, and say, well, we can't eat here, but what do we have to do? Mark a little sign and put it right here, bone here, so that the searchers can come, find that bone, and cleanse the land and put it all in one heap, all in one pile in this one valley, so that from that point onward, there's no Russian bones in Israel except right at that place. And that place signifies God's triumph over Gog and his people Magog.